Welcome to the Monotone Museum. Tonight's exhibit is After Lewis and Clark, The Quiet Years. If you enjoy calm, carefully told history, please like and subscribe to help preserve these stories. Now, settle in, and let's begin. The Lewis and Clark expedition is one of the great adventure stories in American history. 2.5 years, 8,000 miles, 43 men and 1 woman and 1 baby, out to the edge of the known world and back. It has the clean arc of a hero's journey, the departure, the trials, the triumph, the return. But what happened after the return is a different kind of story. It is quieter, it is stranger, it is in many ways more human, because it is the story of what happens when extraordinary people are asked to live ordinary lives after having done something that nothing in ordinary life can match. It is the story of a man who could not survive his own heroism. It is the story of a man who could and spent the next 32 years building something lasting from what they had done together. It is the story of soldiers and hunters and French, trappers and 1 enslaved man and 1 Shoshone interpreter, all scattered across the continent they had crossed, living out the years that history didn't bother to record. Some of those stories are triumphant, some are tragic, some are both. All of them deserve to be told. The year is September 1806. The place is St. Louis, Missouri. 2 men in a keelboat are coming around the last bend in the Missouri River, and the town is coming out to meet them. Breathe slowly. The river is wide and brown. The crowd is cheering on the bank. Something is ending and something else, something harder to name, is beginning. The people of St. Louis had been told 14 months earlier that the expedition was probably dead. This was a reasonable assumption. The cause of discovery had set out in May of 1804, heading into country that no American had mapped, through peoples they did not know, toward mountains whose height and complexity they had badly underestimated. When they did not return by the spring of 1806, when the summer of 1806 came and went without word, a quiet consensus settled over the Missouri frontier. Something had happened out there. The wilderness had taken them. So when the keelboats came around the bend on the afternoon of September 23, 1806, the shock of it was electric. People ran to the riverbank. Guns were fired in celebration. Church bells were rung. The newspaper, the Missouri Gazette, published a breathless account that described the men as having returned from the dead. The Lewis and Clark expedition returned to St. Louis having lost exactly 1 man in 2 years, 4 months, and 9 days of travel, through some of the most demanding terrain on the continent. Sergeant Charles Floyd died on August 20, 1804, near present-day Sioux City, Iowa, of what was almost certainly a ruptured appendix, a condition that would have been fatal anywhere in the world in 1804, with no surgical intervention available. Every other member of the party survived. This survival rate, across 8,000 miles of wilderness travel, is extraordinary by any measure, and speaks to the exceptional planning and leadership of both captains. Lewis and Clark arrived in St. Louis, thin and weathered, their clothes worn through, their faces dark from 2.5 years of outdoor exposure. Their journals, dozens of volumes of observations, maps, botanical descriptions, zoological records, vocabulary lists, ethnographic notes, were intact. Their specimens, plant samples, animal skins and bones, soil samples, mineral samples, were intact. The maps were intact. They had done what Jefferson sent them to do. Every piece of it. The men who came home with them were different from the ones who had left. Patrick Gass, the Irish-American carpenter who would later publish the first account of the expedition, had crossed a continent and come back carrying himself with the particular self-assurance of a man who knows exactly what he is capable of. John Ordway, the meticulous sergeant whose journal was one of the most valuable scientific records of the journey, had seen things that no American east of the Mississippi would see for another generation. George Drouillard, the half-Shoshone, hunter whose skills had fed the expedition through its hungriest stretches, stepped onto the St. Louis levee and looked at the town with eyes that had looked at the Pacific Ocean. They were celebrated. They were toasted. And then, within weeks, the world moved on, because the world always moves on, and the men of the Corps of Discovery were left to figure out what came next. Jefferson's response to the expedition's return was everything Lewis and Clark could have hoped for. The president had been deeply invested in the expedition. He had conceived it, funded it, written the detailed instructions that guided it, and waited anxiously for its return. The news that it had succeeded, that Lewis and Clark had crossed the continent and returned with the maps and the journals and the specimens, must have produced a satisfaction that was almost physical. Jefferson wrote to Lewis immediately. He spoke of the expedition's success in terms that were nearly paternal, the pride of a man whose great project had come to fruition. Thomas Jefferson's instructions to Meriwether Lewis, written in June 1803, were a masterpiece of scientific and diplomatic planning. They directed Lewis to observe and record the geography, flora, fauna, soil, climate, and mineral resources of the territory, to establish relations with the native peoples encountered, to find a practical water route to the Pacific, and to assess the territory's potential for trade and settlement. The instructions ran to approximately 2,500 words and anticipated nearly every significant challenge the expedition would face. Jefferson had been planning this expedition in various forms since at least 1783, more than 20 years before it departed. Congress moved quickly to reward the expedition's leaders. Lewis was appointed governor of Upper Louisiana Territory, a vast administrative domain covering much of what is now the central United States. Clark was appointed superintendent of Indian Affairs and brigadier general of the territorial militia. Both were substantial positions of real power and real responsibility. Both men also received land grants of 1,600 acres each, valuable reals, a state on the frontier that represented significant wealth. The enlisted men received double pay and 320 acres each. Charbonneau received 320 acres and 530 thrales in wages. Sacagawea received nothing. Lewis's appointment as governor was, in retrospect, a kindness that became a trap. He was 32 years old, the most celebrated explorer in America, and he was being asked to sit behind a desk in St. Louis and manage paperwork. For some men, this transition from action to administration is seamless. For Lewis, it was not. Chapter 3. The journals. Before we follow Lewis into the darkness of what came next, we need to understand the journals, because the journals are the central unresolved business of his life after the expedition. And their story is strange and somewhat painful. The expedition had produced an enormous body of written material. Lewis's own journals, Clark's journals, the journals of 4 enlisted men who had been directed to keep records, plus the official correspondence and reports. Collectively, these documents represented the most comprehensive scientific survey of a large territory ever conducted in North America. They contained detailed descriptions of hundreds of plant and animal species previously unknown to science, precise geographical observations that would anchor American cartography for decades, and ethnographic records of native peoples at a moment of first contact with American culture. The Lewis and Clark journals described 178 plants and 122 animals previously unknown to Western science. Among the new plant species, the bitterroot, now Montana's state flower, Clarkia, a flowering plant named for William Clark and Lewis's wild flax. Among the new animal species, the pronghorn antelope, the grizzly bear, known to native peoples but not previously documented by European science, the prairie dog, the black-tailed prairie dog, the mountain beaver, the cutthroat trout, the western, tanager, and Lewis's woodpecker. The grizzly bear encounters in particular produced some of the most dramatic passages in the journals. Lewis described shooting a grizzly 6 times with no apparent effect before the bear finally expired. Jefferson and the public were waiting for publication. The journals were the culmination of the entire enterprise, the scientific harvest that justified the enormous investment of money and men and years. Every educated person in America knew the expedition had happened. Everyone wanted to read the journals. They waited and waited. Lewis, appointed governor, moved to St. Louis and began his administrative duties. He had contracted with a Philadelphia publisher to produce the journals. He corresponded with the botanist Frederick Persch about the plant specimens. He had every intention of completing the work, but the months went by and the journals were not written. Lewis was overwhelmed by the demands of the governorship, an enormously complex political situation involving competing American, French, Spanish, and native interests in a territory the size of Western Europe. He was struggling with debt. He was drinking heavily. The journals sat in their boxes. Jefferson grew anxious. He wrote to Lewis, gently at first and then with increasing urgency, asking about progress. Lewis replied with apologies and promises. The work was coming. It would be done soon. It was never done. Not by Lewis. The journals that the world eventually read, published in 1814, 5 years after Lewis's death, were edited not by Lewis but by Nicholas Biddle, a Philadelphia lawyer who had never been west of the Appalachians. The territory of Upper Louisiana in 1807 was a political thicket of almost incomprehensible complexity. The territory had been French, then Spanish, then French again before the Louisiana Purchase made it American in 1803. It contained a population of French Creole settlers who had been there for generations and who regarded American governance with varying degrees of suspicion. It contained significant numbers of Spanish landholders whose property claims were uncertain under American law. It contained dozens of native nations in various states of relationship with the American government, some friendly, some hostile, most somewhere in between, and it was administered from Washington by officials who had little understanding of any of this through a bureaucratic system that moved at the speed of letters carried on horseback, which meant that a decision made in Washington might take 3 weeks to reach St. Louis and another 3 weeks for a response to return. The administrative challenges Lewis faced as governor of Upper Louisiana were compounded by a specific political conflict with his territorial secretary Frederick Bates. Bates was a career bureaucrat who had been managing territorial affairs during the period between the purchase and Lewis's arrival, and who had developed strong opinions about how things should be done. He and Lewis clashed repeatedly over matters of governance, land claims, and Indian policy. Bates wrote extensively negative accounts of Lewis to officials in Washington, undermining his authority and contributing to the government's refusal to honor several of Lewis's financial expenditures on behalf of the territory. The financial crisis was real and was the immediate trigger of Lewis's final difficulties. As governor, Lewis had authorized various expenditures on behalf of the United States government, payments to interpreters, to native chiefs, to suppliers of goods needed for diplomatic missions. These were normal governmental expenditures, made in good faith, with the expectation that Washington would reimburse them. Washington refused. The reasons were partly bureaucratic. The paperwork was not in order. The proper authorizations had not been obtained in advance, and partly political, the result of Bates's interference and the general incompetence of the territorial administrative system. But the effect was concrete. Lewis was personally liable for approximately $2,000 in government expenditures that the government would not cover. In 1809, $2,000 was a significant sum, roughly equivalent to several years of a working man's wages. He was also, personally, in debt for additional amounts, having borrowed money against the expectation of his governor's salary. His land grants, though valuable in theory, were not producing income. He was 34 years old, the most famous explorer in America, and he was broke. The question of what was happening to Meriwether Lewis in the years between his triumphant return and his death in October 1809 is one that historians have examined for 2 centuries without fully resolving. What is clear from the contemporary accounts is that he was not well. Jefferson, who knew him intimately, wrote after his death that Lewis had always been subject to episodes of hypochondria, the period term for what we would now recognize as depression. Jefferson noted that these episodes had appeared during Lewis's time as his personal secretary in the early 1800s, and that the wilderness of the expedition had seemed to suppress them. The physical demands and the clarity of purpose had kept them at bay. Return to civilization, return to the complexities and frustrations of political life. The episodes came back, and they were worse. The symptoms described in contemporary accounts of Lewis's decline are consistent with what modern medicine would recognize as major depressive disorder, possibly complicated by bipolar disorder. He had periods of high energy and productivity alternating with periods of deep inactivity and despondency. He drank heavily during the bad periods. Alcohol, which in the short term can relieve the symptoms of depression and anxiety, reliably worsens both conditions over time and creates its own dependency that complicates the underlying illness. He was also almost certainly taking laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, which was a standard remedy of the time for pain and anxiety and was freely available at any pharmacy. The combination of alcohol and opiates in a person already suffering from severe depression is profoundly dangerous. The people around him noticed. Clark was in St. Louis, managing his own duties as Indian superintendent, and he saw Lewis regularly. His letters to his brother Jonathan from this period describe his worry about Lewis with a plainness that is moving. He writes that Lewis is not well, that he is drinking too much, that he is not making progress on the journals. Clark was a man of practical competence who expressed affection through action, and his inability to help his friend must have been painful. Lewis's housekeeper and various visitors to his home in St. Louis described a man who slept badly, ate irregularly, spent long hours alone, and seemed unable to begin the work that everyone was waiting for. He had the journals in front of him. He could not write. In the summer of 1809, matters came to a head. The government's refusal to honor his financial disbursements arrived as an official notice. The debt was real. His attempts to resolve the situation through correspondence had failed. He decided to travel to Washington in person, to present his case directly, to bring the journals and begin the process of their publication, and to somehow untangle the financial and political mess that his governorship had become. He booked passage on a boat down the Mississippi, then changed his mind and decided to travel overland through Tennessee on the Natchez Trace. He said he was worried about British interference with an American ship carrying government documents, which was a plausible concern, given that the country was on the edge of another war with Britain, but those who knew him wondered if there was another reason. He left St. Louis in September 1809. He would not reach Washington. The Natchez Trace was one of the great roads of early America, a path of approximately 500 miles running from Natchez, Mississippi, to Nashville, Tennessee, through the forests and wetlands of the Old Southwest. It had begun as a series of trails used by the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and other native peoples of the region, connecting their villages across the difficult terrain of the lower Mississippi Valley. As American settlements spread into the region after the Revolution, the trace became a commercial artery. Flatboatmen who had floated goods down the Mississippi to Natchez or New Orleans would sell their boats for lumber and walk home north on die. The Natchez Trace, because walking upstream against the Mississippi current was impossible. The Natchez Trace in 1809 was a federally maintained road approximately 8 to 10 feet wide, cleared of trees but not surfaced, a dirt track through dense forest that turned to mud in rain and raised clouds of dust in dry weather. It passed through approximately 500 miles of territory that was, outside the small settlements along the way, genuine wilderness. Dense hardwood forest of oak and hickory and tulip poplar, swamps and creek crossings, and the particular oppressive summer heat of the deep south that made travel miserable from June through September. Travelers on the trace were regularly robbed by highwaymen, several of whom became famous for their predations. It was not a safe road. Lewis traveled the trace in September and October of 1809, accompanied by his servant, John Pernier, and, for part of the journey, by a soldier named James Neely, the U.S. Indian agent for the Chickasaw Nation, who joined his party near the Tennessee River. Contemporary accounts of Lewis's behavior during this journey describe a man in severe distress. Neely later wrote to Jefferson that Lewis had made 2 attempts to kill himself during the river portion of the journey, and that the crew of the boat had taken his weapons from him. Whether this account is entirely accurate is disputed. Neely's account has been questioned on various grounds, but something was clearly wrong. Lewis was not sleeping, he was drinking heavily. He spoke incoherently at times. On the night of October 10th, 1809, the party stopped at Grinder's Stand, a small inn on the Natchez Trace run by Robert Grinder and his wife Priscilla in what is now central Tennessee. Neely had stayed behind to recover stray horses. Lewis, Pernier, and the Grinder household were alone. What happened at Grinder's stand in the early morning hours of October 11th, 1809, is one of the enduring mysteries of American history. The account that has come down to us comes primarily from Priscilla Grinder, who told the story multiple times with some variations. In her account, Lewis arrived at the inn in a disturbed state, pacing and talking to himself, drinking from a flask. He ate little. He was given a cabin to sleep in. In the early morning hours, she heard gunshots. 2, she said, or possibly 3, and then a groan, and then silence. In the morning, Lewis was found still alive but grievously wounded, shot through the side, shot in the head, with additional wounds that suggested he had been shot more than once. He died approximately 2 hours later, around sunrise, on October 11th, 1809. He was 35 years old. He said, according to Priscilla Grinder's account, that he was not a coward. He said he had done the business. The debate over whether Meriwether Lewis was murdered or died by suicide has continued for over 200 years and shows no sign of resolution. The suicide theory, supported by Jefferson and most early historians, rests on Lewis's documented mental instability, his history of depression, the 2 reported earlier attempts on the journey, and the circumstances of the wounds, which are consistent with self-inflicted injury. The murder theory, supported by some forensic analysis and circumstantial evidence, points to the multiple gunshot wounds, difficult to self-inflict, the disappearance of Lewis's money, papers, and valuables. After his death, the unreliability of Priscilla Grinder's account and the presence of unknown men in the area. In 1996, a blue ribbon panel including descendants of Lewis petitioned the Tennessee courts to allow an exhumation of his remains for forensic examination. The petition was denied. What is not in doubt is the loss. Lewis was 35 years old. He had done something that no American had done before him, and very few would match. He had the journals, the maps, the observations, the scientific harvest of a lifetime's work compressed into 2.5 extraordinary years. He had the mind that produced them, still capable of producing more. None of that work was done. Jefferson wrote the obituary that mattered in a letter that circulated widely and was eventually published. He described Lewis as a man of courage, undaunted, of fidelity to truth so scrupulous that whatever he should report would be as certain as if seen by ourselves. He noted his mental difficulties with compassion and honesty. He described the expedition's success. He did not describe his grief. He must have felt it. Lewis had been his protege, his secretary, his chosen instrument for the great project of Western exploration. He had watched him grow from a young Virginia neighbor into the most celebrated explorer in America. He had sent him into the wilderness and gotten him back, and then, 3 years later, lost him in a small inn on a dirt road in Tennessee. Jefferson was 66 years old when Lewis died. He had 8 more years to live. The journals were eventually published. The territory was eventually mapped. The country went on. But something specific was gone. To understand what was lost, you have to understand who Lewis was. Not the icon, but the person. He was born in 1774 in Albemarle County, Virginia, on a plantation called Locust Hill, the son of William Lewis and Lucy Meriwether. His father died when he was 5 years old. His mother remarried, and the family moved to Georgia, where Lewis spent his childhood years on another plantation, a childhood of horses and hunting, and the outdoors that produced in him the specific physical and observational competence that the expedition required. He returned to Virginia in his early teens and received a classical education, Latin, geography, mathematics, that was standard for the Virginia gentry, but that he absorbed with unusual depth. He was, by all accounts, an exceptionally intelligent young man with a particular gift for natural history. He noticed plants and animals with the attentive precision of a born naturalist. Meriwether Lewis's botanical knowledge was extensive enough that he was able to describe and classify plant species with scientific accuracy despite having no formal training in botany. The botanist Frederick Persh, who examined Lewis's plant specimens after the expedition, reported that the descriptions were very full and satisfactory, and that Lewis had a thorough knowledge of the plants he had examined. This self-taught, Expertise, developed through years of outdoor observation in Virginia and on the frontier, was one of the primary scientific contributions of the expedition. Lewis described over 170 new plant species. Many of the most significant bear his name. In their scientific nomenclature, he joined the army in 1795, at age 21, and served in the frontier campaigns of the late 1790s, including a period under William Clark's command, which is where the two men first met and formed the friendship that would define both their lives. He rose to captain, developed a reputation for competence and courage, and came to Jefferson's attention through the Virginia networks that connected the planter class of the era. Jefferson appointed him personal secretary in 1801, which meant he lived in the president's house, ate with Jefferson, attended his meetings, read his correspondence, absorbed his thinking. He was there for 2 years before the expedition was organized, during which time Jefferson's extraordinary library and Jefferson's extraordinary mind gave Lewis something he had not had before: context, a framework for understanding the natural world, a vision of what scientific observation could mean. He was, by the time he led the expedition west in 1804, both a man of action and a man of intellect, in a combination that was genuinely rare. He could sleep on the ground in freezing temperatures and wake up before dawn to observe the behavior of a herd of elk, and then return to camp and write a description of the elk's behavior and anatomy that a professional zoologist would find useful and precise. That man died at 35 in a dark cabin in Tennessee, the world noticed. And then, as the world does, it moved on. William Clark lived to be 68 years old. He outlived Lewis by 29 years. He outlived Jefferson by 12. He outlived most of the men who had been young with him, who had walked the same ground, crossed the same rivers, looked at the same mountains. He outlived the world that had made him, and he spent his later years watching the territory he had helped to open fill up with people who had no idea what it had looked like when it was empty. He did not seem to mind this, particularly. Clark was, by temperament and training, a man of practical engagement with the world as it was, rather than the world as it had been. He had a gift for adaptation that Lewis lacked, or perhaps a different relationship to the passage of time. A patience, a willingness to settle into whatever the present required. William Clark was born on August 1st, 1770, in Caroline County, Virginia, the 9th of 10 children in the Clark family. His elder brother, George Rogers Clark, was one of the heroes of the American Revolution, having led the capture of the Northwest Territory from the British in the late 1770s, a campaign so audacious and consequential that it arguably secured American control of the territory between the Appalachians and the Mississippi. William grew up in the shadow of that heroism, following his brother west to the Kentucky frontier and learning the wilderness skills that would define his life. He was always primarily a man of the frontier, rather than a man of the study, and this orientation served him well in the decades after the expedition. Clark was appointed Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Missouri Territory in 1807, a position he held in various forms for the rest of his life, nearly 30 years. It was a position that suited him in some ways and tormented him in others. It suited him because he was genuinely effective at the work. He understood native peoples better than almost any white American official of his era, having spent years in close contact with dozens of nations during the expedition and afterward. He spoke some of several native languages. He had been to the Pacific with Sacagawea and had watched York vote on the Oregon coast. He had a respect for native intelligence and cultural sophistication that was unusual in his time and that made him a more effective negotiator than most. It tormented him because the policy he was required to implement, American expansion into native territory, the steady pressure of settlement, the negotiation of treaties that almost invariably required native peoples to give up land, was in direct conflict with what he knew about those peoples and what he felt, at some level, they deserved. He negotiated. He made the best deals he could. He sometimes intervened on behalf of native peoples when he thought American policy was going too far. He was, within the constraints of the system he served, as decent as the system allowed. It was not enough. It never could have been, but it was what he had. St. Louis, in 1807, was a town of perhaps 2,000 people, clustered along the western bank of the Mississippi at the point where the Missouri joined it just north of town. a confluence that made it the natural gateway to the entire American interior. It was French in character and culture, the legacy of generations of French traders and settlers who had built it as a fur trade center, and it retained that character even as American settlers poured in after the Louisiana Purchase. Clark built a life there. He married Julia Hancock in 1808. She was 17, he was 38, which was less unusual in that era than it would be today, and they had 5 children together. After Julia's death in 1820, he married her cousin Harriet Kennelly, Radford, and had 2 more children. William Clark's family life in St. Louis was, by the standards of his time, domestic and apparently happy. His son, Meriwether Lewis Clark, named naturally for his closest friend, became a military officer and served in the Black Hawk War and the Mexican-American War. Another son, George Rogers Hancock Clark, also served in the military. Clark's house in St. Louis, which he built in the early 1810s, included a large council room where he received Native American delegations and conducted diplomatic business, a physical integration of his personal and professional lives that was characteristic of the man. Clark maintained his friendship with Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, Sacagawea's son, whom he called Pomp, throughout the boy's childhood, enrolling him in school, overseeing his education, acting as the informal father figure that the boy's own father was too unreliable to be. When Jean-Baptiste eventually went to Europe with Prince Paul Wilhelm, Clark gave him his blessing. When he returned, Clark was there to receive him. He also took in Sacagawea's daughter Lisette, the infant girl mentioned in the Fort Manuel death record of 1812, the child left behind when Sacagawea died. Lisette appears in Clark's guardianship records. What happened to her afterward is not known. She disappears from the historical record, as so many people in this story do, into the gap between the documented and the remembered. Clark kept maps. He kept working on the great map of the West that had been the expedition's primary cartographic product, incorporating new information as it came in from subsequent expeditions and traders and explorers. The map evolved over the decades, becoming more accurate, more detailed, more useful. It was, in a sense, his life's work. Not the expedition itself, which was the dramatic event, but the slow accumulation of geographical knowledge that the expedition had begun and that he spent 30 years completing. The decades of Clark's service as Indian superintendent encompassed some of the most consequential and some of the most painful events in the history of American native relations. He negotiated dozens of treaties, land cession agreements in which native nations gave up territory in exchange for annuities, trade goods, and promises of protection that were honored, with varying degrees of reliability. He was present for the Fort Osage Treaty of 1808, the first treaty negotiated after the expedition's return. He was the primary American negotiator for a series of treaties with the Osage, the Sauk and Fox, the Iowa, the Kickapoo, and many other nations in the decades that followed. The treaties Clark negotiated as Indian superintendent were, with a few exceptions, agreements under which native peoples ceded millions of acres of land to the United States in exchange for payments of goods, annuities of money or supplies, and promises of American protection and support. The terms were rarely honored in full by the American side. The land transfers were permanent. By the time Clark retired from active service in the 1830s, the native nations of the Missouri River Valley had ceded most of the territory between the Mississippi and the Rocky Mountains. Through the treaty system he had helped to develop, he understood this trajectory. His letters from the period show a man who was deeply uncomfortable with the direction of American policy and who felt personally responsible, in some measure, for outcomes he had not intended and could not stop. Black Hawk War of 1832 was perhaps the event that most clearly illustrated the tragedy of Clark's position. Black Hawk was a Sauk war leader who refused to accept the validity of a treaty, signed in 1804 by Sauk representatives who may not have had the authority to cede the land, that had transferred Sauk homeland on the Rock River in Illinois to the United States. Black Hawk had been a British ally in the War of 1812. He distrusted American promises and American treaties, not without reason. In 1832, he led a band of Sauk, Fox, and Kickapoo people back across the Mississippi into Illinois. ostensibly to plant crops on their former homeland, and the American military response was swift and brutal. The Black Hawk War ended with the Battle of Bad Axe, in which American soldiers and Menominee allies attacked Sauk people who were trying to cross the Mississippi back into Wisconsin, killing somewhere between 150 and 200 people, many of them women and children trying to swim to safety. Clark was not at Bad Axe, but the war had been fought, in part, on the basis of treaties he had negotiated and the system of Indian administration he had helped to build. He received Black Hawk in St. Louis after the war leader's capture, and the two men had a meeting that was recorded in several accounts. What passed between them, between the conqueror and the conquered, between the man who had spent his life negotiating and the man who had refused to accept the negotiated outcome, is not fully known. Clark was 62 years old. He had been managing this impossible situation for 25 years. He was tired. Clark's last decade was quieter. He had outlived so many people: Lewis, Jefferson, most of the expedition members, his first wife, many of his colleagues and rivals in the long drama of Western expansion. He was famous in St. Louis in a way that was both gratifying and slightly odd. The famous explorer became the distinguished elder statesman, invited to dinners, consulted by politicians, sought out by the writers and artists and adventurers who were passing through St. Louis on their way west. Washington Irving visited him. Prince Paul Wilhelm of Württemberg, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau's European patron, called on him. George Catlin, the painter who had devoted his career to portraying native peoples, passed through St. Louis and painted Clark's portrait. George Catlin's portrait of William Clark, painted around 1830 when Clark was approximately 60 years old, shows a heavy-set man with white hair and a direct, unsmiling gaze. Catlin described Clark in his letters as one of the most impressive men he had met in the West, not for his physical presence, which age had softened, but for his knowledge. The 30 years of accumulated understanding of the territory and its peoples that made him a living encyclopedia of a world that was rapidly changing. Catlin was, at this point, engaged in the same kind of preservation that Clark had spent his life trying to do through treaties and administration, trying to capture something before it was gone. Clark's health declined in the mid-1830s. He had the ailments of an old man who had spent decades in demanding physical conditions: rheumatism, respiratory problems, the general wearing down of a body that had been asked to do extraordinary things for a very long time. He continued working as long as he could, attending to the Indian Affairs Office, receiving visitors, corresponding with the government about the increasingly urgent question of what to do about the native peoples being displaced by the accelerating tide of American settlement. He died on September 1, 1838, in St. Louis, at the home of his son Meriwether Lewis Clark. He was 68 years old. He had outlived the expedition by 32 years. He had outlived Meriwether Lewis by 29 years. He had outlived by decades most of the world that had made him who he was. St. Louis gave him a state funeral, a procession through the streets, military honors, the full ceremony of a man who had built the city in which he died, who had shaped the territory in which it stood, who had walked to the Pacific Ocean and back before most of the mourners were born. He was buried at Bellefontaine Cemetery, on a bluff above the Missouri River. The river, brown and wide and indifferent to human ceremony, moved past below. Patrick Gass was born on June 12, 1771, in Falling Spring, Pennsylvania, the son of Irish immigrants. He was 33 years old when the expedition departed, the oldest of the enlisted men, a compact and powerful carpenter who had spent years in the frontier militia and who possessed the practical intelligence and physical endurance that the expedition required. He was also, it turned out, a writer. Gass kept a journal during the expedition, one of the 4 enlisted men's journals that survived from the Corps of Discovery. His journal was less scientifically detailed than Lewis's or Clark's, but it was vivid and readable, written with the plain directness of a man who wanted to describe what he had seen, rather than analyze it. Patrick Gass published the first account of the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1807, 3 years before Lewis died, and 7 years before the official journals were published. His Journal of the Voyages and Travels of a Corps of Discovery was an immediate bestseller. It went through 6 editions in the United States and was translated into French, German, and Russian. Jefferson and Lewis were not entirely pleased. Lewis had a financial interest in being the first to publish and complained that Gass's unauthorized publication had damaged his commercial prospects. But Gass's journal was the document that introduced the expedition to the world, and its success helped build the public appetite for the official journals when they finally appeared in 1814. After the expedition, Gass served in the army through the War of 1812, losing his left eye in a non-combat accident during the conflict. He received a pension for his disability and settled in Western Virginia. He was known in his later years as a storyteller of the First Order, a man who had been to the Pacific Ocean and back, who had fought in 2 wars, who had an eye patch and a lifetime of extraordinary experiences to draw on. He married at 60 years old to a woman of 20, Maria Hamilton, who bore him 7 children. He lived to be 98 years old. Patrick Gass outlived Lewis by 63 years. He outlived Clark by 30 years. He outlived the Civil War, which ended in 1865. He was alive during Reconstruction. He died on April 2, 1870, in Wellsburg, West Virginia, a veteran of a wilderness expedition that had set out 66 years earlier. At his death, he was the last surviving member of the Corps of Discovery. He had crossed the continent and come back and lived nearly a century, and the world he died in was so different from the world he had been born in that the two shared almost nothing except the stars above them. John Ordway was perhaps the most reliable journalist of the entire expedition. His journal, which covered the entire journey from Camp Dubois to the return without a single gap, was described by historians as the most complete and consistent of all the enlisted men's journals. A day-by-day account written in a clear, unembellished hand that gave future historians an invaluable baseline record against which to check the captain's more selective journals. He was from New Hampshire, one of the very few New Englanders in the expedition. He was 26 when they departed. A sergeant, well educated by the standards of frontier soldiers, he could write fluently and clearly, an uncommon skill in the army of 1804. John Ordway's journal was not published until 1916, over 100 years after the expedition. It had been purchased from Ordway by Clark after the expedition's return, and then sat unpublished in the Clark family papers for generations. When historian Milo Quaife finally located and published it, scholars recognized it as a major historical document. Ordway's meticulous daily records filled gaps in Lewis's and Clark's journals and provided crucial cross-references that helped historians reconstruct the expedition's chronology. After the expedition, Ordway used his land grant and double pay to purchase farmland in southeast Missouri near the town of New Madrid. He was prosperous, briefly, a successful frontier farmer, married, with children, and then the New Madrid earthquakes happened. On December 16, 1811, and again on January 23 and February 7, 1812, 3 earthquakes struck the New Madrid seismic zone, among the largest earthquakes in recorded North American history. The February 7th earthquake is estimated by seismologists to have had a magnitude between 7.5 and 8.0, making it one of the most powerful earthquakes in the recorded history of the continental United States. The New Madrid earthquakes of 1811-1812 were catastrophic events that reshaped the geography of the central Mississippi Valley. The earthquakes caused the Mississippi River to run backward for a period, created new lakes. Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee still exists as a result of land subsidence from the quake, destroyed forests over hundreds of square miles, and caused structural damage as far away as Washington, D.C., where the shaking was felt and chimneys fell. Eyewitness accounts describe the ground rolling in waves, trees snapping, fissures opening in the earth, and the Mississippi River erupting in geysers of sand and water. John James Audubon, who was in the region during one of the aftershocks, described the experience with obvious terror. Ordway's farm was in the affected area. The full extent of the damage to his property is not known. What is known is that he appears in no records after 1817. He simply disappears from the historical record, as so many people in this story do, into the gap between the documented and the forgotten. The man who had kept the most complete daily record of the most important American expedition of the century was himself unrecorded in death. We do not know where he died, or when, or how. He left his journal behind him, and his journal survived him, and the journal told the story that he could not. George Drouillard, the half-Shoshone, half-French-Canadian hunter and sign language interpreter whose skills had been so essential to the expedition that Lewis described him as a man of much merit, had the shortest post-expedition life of any of the principal members of the E Corps. He returned to the fur trade. It was what he knew, what he was built for. The long days alone in the wilderness, reading the landscape for animal sign, moving quietly through country that most men couldn't navigate. He signed on with Manuel Lisa's Missouri Fur Company and went back up the river almost immediately after the expedition's return, heading back into the mountains that Lewis and Clark had just come out of. George Drouillard, c. 1773-1810, was the son of a French-Canadian father and a Shoshone mother, raised in the bilingual, bicultural world of the Great Lakes fur trade. He spoke French, English, and several native languages, and was fluent in the Plains Sign Language that served as a lingua franca across the diverse linguistic communities of the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains. Lewis described him in the expedition journals as indispensable. His hunting skills kept the expedition fed during the critical early stages, and his ability to communicate through sign language was crucial in dozens of encounters with Plains, tribes whose spoken languages the expedition members did not know. Drouillard spent 3 years in the mountains after the expedition, trapping and trading in the upper Missouri country. He was at the Three Forks of the Missouri in the spring of 1810, the same Three Forks where Sacagawea had been captured years before, the same Three Forks where the Blackfoot were actively hostile to American trappers. He had been warned. The Blackfoot had killed 2 men from Lisa's operation already that spring. Other trappers had pulled back from the area. Drouillard, by most accounts, was dismissive of the danger. He had been in dangerous country his whole life, and he had an experienced woodsman's perhaps understandable confidence in his own ability to avoid being caught. He was caught. In May of 1810, a Blackfoot war party found his trail and followed it. He was ambushed, probably while setting traps on a creek near the Three Forks. He was killed, and by the accounts of men who found the scene afterward, had not died easily. The tracks in the ground told a story of a man who had fought very hard, alone, against multiple opponents. He was approximately 37 years old. John Coulter, who had left the expedition at the Mandan villages and had already survived his own extraordinary Blackfoot encounters, learned of Drouillard's death and used it as the final piece of evidence that the Three Forks country was too dangerous. He left the mountains for good shortly afterward. The hunter who had fed the cause of discovery through its leanest stretches died in the mountains where he had always been most alive. He left nothing in the way of records or memoirs. He left only the impression he made on others, the journals of Lewis and Clark, where his name appears dozens of times as the man who found the game when no one else could. Of all the stories of what became of the expedition members, York's is the most uncomfortable and the most important. York was William Clark's enslaved servant. He had been with Clark since childhood, had made the entire journey to the Pacific and back, had been present at every critical moment of the expedition, had voted on the Oregon coast in November 1805. He was, by the evidence of the journals, an effective and contributing member of the expedition in every practical sense. He came home to slavery. He had been gone for 2.5 years. He had seen things that almost no American had seen. He had crossed the Rocky Mountains and the Bitterroots and stood on the shore of the Pacific Ocean. He had been treated, by the native peoples they encountered, with curiosity and respect. Many tribes considered him a person of great spiritual power, and his presence had opened doors that would otherwise have been closed. He had been in the world west of the Missouri, something approaching free. In St. Louis, he was Clark's property. His legal status had not changed. The world had not changed. He was enslaved. York asked Clark for his freedom after the expedition's return. Clark refused. The exact nature of their subsequent conflict is documented in Clark's letters, which describe York as insolent and sulky, and mention that he had asked to be hired out to work in Louisville so he could be near his wife, who was enslaved to a different owner. Clark initially refused this as well, then relented somewhat. Clark's letters from this period describe York with a mixture of irritation and what seems to be genuine perplexity. Clark could not quite understand why a man who had been treated well, who had been given remarkable experiences, who was provided with food and shelter, would be dissatisfied with his condition. The perplexity itself is a measure of the profound moral blindness that slavery required of the people who practiced it. The precise timeline of York's eventual freedom is uncertain. Clark wrote to his brother Jonathan in 1811 that he had freed York, but no formal manumission document has been found. Washington Irving, who spoke with Clark in 1832, recorded Clark as saying that he had freed York and that York had started a freight hauling business in Tennessee that had failed, and that he had died of cholera while trying to return to St. Louis and rejoin Clark's service. This account may be true. It may be partially true. It may be a story that Clark told himself and told others. That was more comfortable than the truth. We cannot know. What we know is that York walked to the Pacific Ocean and voted for the winter camp in November 1805 and came home to find that none of it had changed anything. He was still property. He had to ask permission to be near his wife. The world that celebrated Lewis and Clark had nothing to celebrate in what happened to York. His name does not appear on any monument at Grinder's Stand, or at Fort Mandan, or at Fort Clatsop. It appears in the journals dozens of times as a contributing member of the expedition, as the man whose presence changed the diplomatic dynamic at every native village they visited. And it appears in Clark's letters, in the record of a man asking for his freedom and being refused. He asked. He deserved it. He waited years to receive it, if he received it at all. History owes him more than it has given, very deep now. Let the facts settle like snow settling on still water. The story is nearly done, but there is so much more to hold. The official account of the Lewis and Clark expedition was published in 1814, 5 years after Lewis's death, and 8 years after the expedition's return, edited by Nicholas Biddle. Biddle was a remarkable choice in some ways, and a peculiar one in others. He was a Philadelphia lawyer, and later the president of the Second Bank of the United States, a man of letters and intellect who had the organizational and editorial skills that Lewis had lacked. He had never been west of Philadelphia. To prepare the journals for publication, he corresponded extensively with Clark and with George Shannon, one of the expedition's youngest members, and conducted a long interview with Clark in which the explorer described the journey in the kind of practical, direct language that Clark used naturally. Nicholas Biddle's editing of the Lewis and Clark journals has been both praised and criticized by subsequent historians. Biddle condensed the journals significantly, reducing 2.5 years of daily entries into a single narrative of manageable length, and in doing so made choices about what to include and what to leave out that shaped how the expedition was understood for generations. He omitted much of the scientific material, the detailed botanical and zoological descriptions, condensed the ethnographic observations, and removed some of the more personal passages from Lewis's journals. The full, unedited journals were not published until the 20th century. Reuben Goldthwaites produced an 8-volume scholarly edition between 1904 and 1905, and Gary Moulton's definitive 13-volume edition was completed in 2001. The 1814 publication was well received, but not the sensation that might have been expected, partly because Gass's unauthorized account had already satisfied much of the public's curiosity, and partly because the country was in the middle of the War of 1812 and had other things to think about. The book sold steadily rather than brilliantly, but its importance was not primarily commercial. The journals, even in Biddle's condensed form, were the primary record of the most significant geographical exploration in American history. They contained the descriptions of the native peoples, the landscapes, the animals and plants, the rivers, and mountains that would define American understanding of the West for a generation. They became, over time, one of the foundational texts of American identity. The story of a young nation walking to the edge of its own continent and looking out at the Pacific. Lewis had planned to write that story himself. He had planned to stand at the center of it, to give it his voice and his intelligence and his poet's gift for description. Instead, it was given to a Philadelphia lawyer who had never seen the Missouri River. What we lost in Lewis's death was that voice. The journals that survive are remarkable. The journals Lewis might have written had he lived are the great unmade thing of American literature. The effects of the Lewis and Clark expedition on American history unfolded over decades in ways that were both intended and unintended. The maps changed everything first. Clark's great map, incorporating the geographical knowledge of the expedition and the information collected in the years afterward, was the most accurate representation of the American West available for a generation. It showed the routes, the rivers, the mountain passes. It showed the way through. And the way through was what every subsequent explorer, trapper, missionary, and settler needed. The Oregon Trail, the great emigrant route that carried approximately 400,000 settlers from Missouri to Oregon, California, and Utah between 1840 and 1869, followed, for much of its length, the route that Lewis and Clark had mapped. South Pass in Wyoming, the gentle crossing of the Continental Divide that made wagon travel possible, was first navigated by a returning Astorian party in 1812 and confirmed by the fur traders of the 1820s. But it was Lewis and Clark's mapping of the general route through the Rockies that established the conceptual framework. Without their maps, the emigrant era might have been delayed by a generation or more. The fur trade expanded enormously in the years after the expedition. The knowledge Lewis and Clark had brought back about the beaver populations of the upper Missouri and the Rocky Mountain streams was directly responsible for the rush of trappers into those regions. Manuel Lisa's Missouri Fur Company, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company, all of which sent men into the mountains in the decade after the expedition's return, all of which were acting in part on information that Lewis and Clark had provided. The political consequences were more complicated. The expedition had established an American claim to the Oregon country, the Pacific Northwest, that became the basis for the American position in the long diplomatic dispute with Britain over the territory. The Oregon Territory was finally divided between the two countries in 1846, with the United States retaining everything south of the 49th parallel. This settlement was built, partly, on the argument that Americans had been there first, had mapped it, had walked it, had planted a fort at its mouth, and spent a miserable winter in the rain. That argument rested on Lewis and Clark. And behind Lewis and Clark, as we have seen, stood Sacagawea, without whom the mountains would not have been crossed, the Shoshone horses would not have been obtained, the translation chain would have broken at its most critical link. The monument at the Pacific coast at the reconstructed Fort Clatsop carries all their names now. It took a long time to put some of them there. The expedition's most lasting and most painful legacy was the one that Jefferson had at least partially intended. It opened the American West to settlement, and the settlement destroyed the world that the expedition had documented. The native peoples that Lewis and Clark had encountered, described, negotiated with, the Mandan and Hidatsa, the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, the Columbia River peoples, the coastal nations of the Pacific Northwest, all faced in the decades after 1806 the increasing pressure of American expansion, and all were profoundly changed by it. The Mandans suffered first and most catastrophically. The Mandan people, whose Earth Lodge villages on the upper Missouri had been the expedition's winter home in 1804, 1805, and the staging point for the western journey, were virtually wiped out by a smallpox epidemic in 1837. The epidemic, carried upriver on the American Fur Company steamboat St. Peter's, killed an estimated 90% of the Mandan people in a matter of months, reducing a population of perhaps 1,600 people to approximately 125 survivors. The Mandan had no immunity to smallpox, which was endemic in European populations, but catastrophically lethal in peoples without previous exposure. The epidemic of 1837 also devastated the neighboring Hidatsa and Arikara nations. The great villages that Lewis and Clark had found bustling with 4,000 people were empty within a generation. Their reckoning came in 1877 when the US government attempted to force the Nez Perce onto a reduced reservation. Chief Joseph, one of the great figures of the era, a man of extraordinary intelligence and dignity, led a group of non-treaty, Nez Perce in a fighting retreat of nearly 1,200 miles through Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, attempting to reach Canada and safety. They were caught 40 miles from the Canadian border in the Bear Paw Mountains of Montana after a 5-day siege in October snow. Chief Joseph's surrender speech, "From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever," is one of the most quoted sentences in American history. He was speaking from a battlefield approximately 300 miles north of where Sacagawea had been born, in the mountains that Lewis and Clark had crossed, in the country that the expedition had opened. The connection is not incidental. It is the central fact of the expedition's legacy. It opened the country, and the opening destroyed the world that was there. Lewis and Clark did not intend this and could not have prevented it. But they were part of it. George Shannon was the youngest member of the Corps of Discovery, 18 years old when the expedition departed, from Pennsylvania, a frontier boy with good wilderness skills and an unfortunate tendency to get lost. Got lost twice during the expedition. The first time was spectacular. In late August of 1804, on the Missouri River in what is now South Dakota, Shannon somehow got separated from the main party while looking for stray horses. He spent 16 days alone on the plains, unable to find the expedition, traveling ahead of it rather than behind it, running out of food, surviving on grapes, and a rabbit he killed with a stick before the expedition finally caught up with him. George Shannon's 16-day solo expedition on the Missouri Plains in August and September 1804 is one of the more remarkable incidents in the journals. He had assumed the main party was ahead of him and had been pushing hard to catch up, in the wrong direction. He was reduced to trying to kill deer with sticks, having run out of ball for his rifle, and surviving on wild fruit before the expedition's lead boat finally overtook him. He had traveled approximately 100 miles more than necessary. He was thin and exhausted when he climbed aboard the keelboat. Lewis noted the incident with a mixture of relief and mild exasperation. Shannon went on to have one of the more interesting post-expedition careers of any Corps member. He returned to the mountains briefly, was badly wounded in an Arikara attack on an 1807 expedition that Lewis had organized to return a Mandan chief to his village. Shannon was shot in the leg, and the wound was severe enough that the leg was amputated. He then went to law school. Shannon studied law in Lexington, Kentucky, under the jurist Robert Wycliffe, and was admitted to the bar. He became a successful attorney and later a state legislator in Missouri. He assisted Nicholas Biddle in editing the journals, his interview with Biddle in 1810, where he described the expedition from memory, filled in many of the gaps left by Lewis's and Clark's selective journal keeping. He died in 1836 in Missouri at 50 years old. He had been the youngest member of the expedition and had outlived Lewis by 27 years. Sergeant Nathaniel Pryor was one of the most capable men in the Corps of Discovery, a natural leader who was trusted by both captains with independent commands on multiple occasions, including a solo mission on the return journey where he led a small party across the plains with a herd of horses, navigating by the stars and arriving at the rendezvous point on time. After the expedition, Pryor served in the army through the War of 1812 and rose to the rank of captain. He married an Osage woman and settled in what is now Oklahoma, in the heart of Osage territory, living as a trader and farmer among the people who had been his diplomatic charges as Clark's representative in the early years of the Missouri Territory. Nathaniel Pryor, 1772–1831, spent much of his post-expedition life in the Osage Nation, where he had strong personal connections through his marriage. He was respected by both the Osage people and the American authorities as a man who understood both worlds, a mediator in the tradition of the mountain men and the early fur traders, living across cultural lines that most Americans of his era refused to cross. He died in 1831 in what is now northeastern Oklahoma, in the territory that would become the Indian Territory, where displaced native nations were relocated in the forced removals of the 1830s. Pryor's grave is in northeastern Oklahoma. It is marked with a stone that notes his membership in the Corps of Discovery. The town of Pryor Creek, Oklahoma, is named for him. He is not widely remembered. Most Americans who know the Lewis and Clark story know Lewis and Clark, and perhaps Sacagawea, and perhaps York. They do not know Nathaniel Pryor who navigated across the Montana plains by starlight with a herd of horses and lived the rest of his life on the cultural frontier between two worlds. These are the men who made the expedition possible and who were not made into legends by it. There were dozens of them. Their names are in the journals, in the muster rolls, in the occasional newspaper account and land-grant record. They crossed the continent and came home and lived their lives, mostly in obscurity, mostly unremarked. They deserve to be known. The scientific harvest of the Lewis and Clark expedition, while it took years to be fully processed and published, eventually transformed American natural history. The plant specimens that Lewis had collected, carefully pressed and dried in paper, labeled in his precise handwriting, packed in tin containers that had protected them through rivers and mountain crossings and the miserable wet winter on the Pacific coast, were examined by the Philadelphia botanist Frederick Persh, who published a formal botanical classification of the new species in 1814, the same year as Biddle's expedition account. Frederick Persh's Flora Americae Septentrionalis, 1814, formally described and classified 132 plant specimens from the Lewis and Clark expedition, incorporating Lewis's field observations into the scientific nomenclature. The expedition's plants are represented in the scientific names by the species epithet Lewisii or Lewisia. Lewisia rediviva, the bitter root, now Montana's state flower, was named for Lewis, as was Clarkia, a genus of flowering plants named for Clark. The bitter root has a particular resonance. It was a critical food source for the Shoshone and Nez Perce, and Sacagawea would have gathered it throughout her childhood. It was one of the plants she identified for the expedition as edible. The zoological specimens were examined by various naturalists over the years, with the formal scientific descriptions appearing piecemeal in different publications. The grizzly bear, described by Lewis with great vividness and some awe in the journals after multiple encounters in which the bears proved nearly impossible to kill, was formally described as Ursus arctos horribilis, the horrible grizzly. The pronghorn antelope became Antilocapra americana. The prairie dog became Cynomys ludovicianus. The black-tailed magpie became Pica hudsonia. Lewis had observed all of these animals with the careful attention of a trained naturalist, describing their appearance, behavior, habitat, and relationship to other species with an accuracy that later scientists confirmed. The observations he made in the field, often written in the few hours between arriving at camp and going to sleep, were good science. The geographical legacy was perhaps even more consequential. Clark's map, published in 1814 in conjunction with Biddle's narrative, was the most accurate large-scale map of the American West produced to that date. It showed the course of the Missouri River from its source to its mouth. It showed the Rocky Mountains, their general location and orientation, the major passes, the river systems on both sides. It showed the Columbia River system and its tributaries. It showed, for the first time, the approximate shape of the entire Trans-Mississippi West. Subsequent explorers, John C. Fremont, Zebulon Pike, Stephen Long, the great topographical engineers of the 1840s and 1850s, all used Clark's map as a foundation, correcting and adding to it but never replacing its basic structure. It remained the most useful map of the West for over a generation. 2 centuries after his death, Meriwether Lewis remains a figure of genuine historical mystery and genuine historical sadness. The mystery is the manner of his death, which the historical evidence cannot resolve with certainty. The suicide interpretation, supported by Jefferson's account and most early historians, rests on the documented evidence of his depression and the circumstances at Grinder's stand. The murder interpretation, supported by some physical evidence and circumstantial arguments, cannot be fully dismissed. What matters more than the mystery is the sadness. Lewis was 35 years old. He had done something that no American had done before him. He had walked to the Pacific Ocean, alone in no sense that matters. He had 42 companions, but alone in the sense of leadership, alone in the weight of the responsibility, alone in the quality of attention that the expedition required of him. He had looked at grizzly bears and geysers, and the continental divide and the Pacific Ocean with the eyes of a scientist and a writer, and he had recorded what he saw in language that was sometimes flat and practical and sometimes genuinely beautiful. Among the most celebrated passages in the Lewis and Clark journals is Lewis's description of the Great Falls of the Missouri, written on June 13, 1805, the day he first saw them. He wrote that the scene combined to form a truly magnificent and sublimely grand spectacle that left him disgusted with his own inability to describe it adequately. He called it the grandest sight I ever beheld, and wished for the ability of a painter to capture what he saw. The passage reveals a man with genuine literary aspirations, an awareness of what language could do, combined with a frustrating sense of its limitations when confronted with something that exceeded its reach. That man, who wanted to write, and knew what writing could be, died having written almost nothing of the great work he had planned. What might Lewis have written if he had lived? The journals he kept during the expedition are enough to tell us that he had a gift, the gift of a man who looked carefully and cared about what he saw and could find language for it that was more than merely functional. The full publication of the journals, completed only in 2001 with Gary Moulton's definitive edition, reveals a writer who was, in his best moments, as good as any American writer of his era. He never wrote the book. The depression, the debt, the administrative failures, the bottle, all of it closed around him in the 3 years between the expedition's return and his death on the Natchez Trace, and the book he might have written remained unwritten. Clark finished the map. He finished the official record. He spent 30 more years being the man that Lewis could not be. Steady, practical, effective, present. He did the work. But Lewis's absence is felt in everything the expedition left behind. The journals are extraordinary, and they would have been more. The science is good, and it would have been more. The literature is there, in fragments, in the best passages, and it would have been more. He was 35. He had so much more to give. By the time William Clark died in 1838, the territory that he and Lewis had crossed 32 years earlier was utterly transformed. St. Louis, the small French Creole town of 2,000 people that had welcomed the expedition home, was a city of 16,000, the gateway to the west. A roaring commercial center where steamboats lined the levee and the streets were full of merchants and land speculators and the restless young men who were heading west in increasing numbers every year. The Missouri River, which the expedition had spent 5 months ascending in keelboats and pirogues, was now navigated by steamboats. The first steamboat reached the upper Missouri in 1819, and by the 1830s, regular steamboat service reached the Mandan villages. The journey that had taken Lewis and Clark 5 months took a steamboat perhaps 6 weeks. The steamboat Yellowstone, owned by the American Fur Company, made the first successful steamboat voyage to the upper Missouri in 1832, reaching Fort Union, at the mouth of the Yellowstone River, approximately 1,800 miles upstream from St. Louis. The voyage took approximately 3 months. The painter George Catlin was aboard, heading upriver to paint the native peoples of the northern plains. The journey that had taken Lewis and Clark a full summer was accomplished by a steam-powered vessel in a season. Within 2 decades, steamboats would be a routine presence on the upper Missouri, transforming the fur trade, the pace of settlement, and the lives of every native nation along the river's banks. The Rocky Mountains, which had nearly killed the expedition in the autumn of 1805, were being crossed regularly by the 1820s. The annual rendezvous of the Rocky Mountain fur trade, the great summer gathering of trappers and traders and native peoples that we followed in our earlier story of the last free trapper, was underway by 1825, its routes through the mountains following paths that Lewis and Clark had opened and mapped, and the emigrants were coming. The first wagon trains were crossing South Pass in the late 1830s. By 1841, the year after the last rendezvous, the Bidwell-Bartleson party was crossing the Rockies in wagons heading for California. The trickle would become a flood. Clark, in his last years, watched this from St. Louis. He watched the river fill with steamboats. He watched the territory fill with settlers. He watched the native peoples he had spent 30 years trying to protect being squeezed out of the land they had occupied for thousands of years. He had made this possible. He had mapped the way. He had spent 3 decades as Indian superintendent trying to manage a process that could not be managed humanely, trying to put acceptable forms on something that was, at its root, a dispossession. He did not stop it. No one person could have stopped it. The forces driving American expansion west were larger than any individual, larger than Jefferson, larger than Lewis and Clark, larger than the entire apparatus of exploration and diplomacy and treaty-making that had been deployed to manage it. He died watching it happen, from a house on the bluffs above the Missouri River. There are graves across the American landscape that mark the resting places of the men and women who made the Lewis and Clark expedition. Meriwether Lewis is buried on the Natchez Trace Parkway in central Tennessee, approximately 72 miles southwest of Nashville. A broken shaft of stone, the traditional memorial to a life cut short, marks his grave. The parkway is quiet here, the forest old growth in places, the kind of dense southern hardwood forest that he would have been riding through when he stopped at Grinder's stand. There is a visitor center. There are interpretive signs. William Clark is buried at Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis, on a bluff above the Missouri River that he helped to shape. The cemetery is large and old, full of the graves of the people who built St. Louis, the French Creole families, the American merchants, the politicians and river captains and fur traders. Clark's monument is substantial, a tall obelisk of grey stone, his name and dates carved in the face of it. Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis, established in 1849, is one of the oldest rural cemeteries in the United States and contains the graves of many figures significant in Missouri and American history. William Clark's grave is one of the most visited sites in the cemetery. Also buried at Bellefontaine, William Tecumseh Sherman, the Civil War general, and Thomas Hart Benton, the Missouri senator who championed Western expansion for 3 decades. The cemetery sits on a bluff above the Missouri River, and on clear days you can see the river from the higher sections, the same river that Clark spent so much of his life on, brown and wide and still moving. Patrick Gass is buried in Wellsburg, West Virginia, where he died in 1870 at 98 years old. His gravestone notes that he was the last surviving member of the cause of discovery. The town of Wellsburg has a small park in his honor. George Drouillard has no known grave. He died somewhere near the Three Forks of the Missouri in May of 1810, and his remains were never recovered. He is commemorated by a historical marker near Three Forks, Montana, in the country where he died. John Ordway has no known grave. He disappeared from the historical record around 1817. He is commemorated by the journal he left behind, which sat unpublished for nearly a century before historians recognized its value. York has no known grave. The precise facts of his life after the expedition cannot be confirmed. He is commemorated by a statue at the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail Interpretive Center in Great Falls, Montana, and by the entry in Clark's journal from November 24, 1805, where his vote is recorded alongside every other member of the expedition. Sacagawea has 2 graves on 2 sides of the country, each supported by different evidence and different traditions. Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau is buried in Dana, Oregon, where he died in May of 1866 while traveling to the Montana goldfields at 61 years old. He is the last in this story to go. The Missouri River still flows past St. Louis. It is wider in some places now, narrower in others, its course altered by the engineering of generations, levees and channel work, and the 6 dams that turned its upper reaches into a series of reservoirs. But it is still the same river, still brown with the silt of the Rocky Mountains, still moving east toward the Mississippi and the Gulf. In its upper reaches, above Fort Peck Dam in Montana, the river is still largely as it was, the white cliffs of the Missouri. The pale limestone formations that Lewis described as resembling ancient ruins, the formations that Sacagawea passed without recorded comment, and Drouillard passed looking for sign of game, are still there. Rising 60 feet above the river in their wind-carved columns and arches, you can float that stretch in a canoe. People do in the summer. They camp on the sandbars that Lewis and Clark camped on and look at the same cliffs in the same late afternoon light. The light is still the same, that particular amber of a clear day at high latitude in summer, when the sun is low enough to catch the cliff faces at an angle and make them glow from within. The Upper Missouri River Breaks National Monument, established in 2001 and covering approximately 375,000 acres of the Missouri River Corridor in central Montana, protects the stretch of the Missouri River between Fort Benton and the Fort Peck Reservoir. This 149-mile stretch of river is one of the least altered sections of the Missouri, retaining much of its historical character. The Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail designation covers the entire route of the expedition, from Camp Dubois in Illinois to Fort Clatsop in Oregon, approximately 3,700 miles in each direction. The trail is maintained by the National Park Service and can be followed, in various degrees of authenticity, by car, canoe, horseback, or foot. The Bitterroot Mountains still rise above the Idaho-Montana border. Lemhi Pass is still there, at 7,373 feet on the Continental Divide, a dirt road now running over it, where once there was only a game trail. You can drive it in a pickup truck or hike it. On the Idaho side, the Lemhi River Valley opens below you, the valley where Sacagawea was born, green and narrow, the mountains rising on both sides. The bitterroot still blooms in Montana in late May and early June, the small pink flowers appearing in the rocky soil before almost anything else, the plant's remarkable ability to survive desiccation, allowing it to revive after months of dormancy. Lewis collected it in 1806 on the return journey near the Bitterroot Valley, dried it in his specimen press, and sent it to Philadelphia. Frederick Persh found it apparently dead in 1814 and planted it experimentally, and it revived and bloomed. Alive after years in a box, after crossing the continent, after everything, Lewis named it Louisa Rediviva. Rediviva means brought back to life. He did not live to see it bloom. In the end, the story of the Lewis and Clark expedition's aftermath is the story of two men who were, in some fundamental ways, opposites, and who together made something that neither could have made alone. Lewis had the vision, the scientific mind, the literary gift, the intensity that drove him through experiences that would have stopped a lesser person. He had the capacity for wonder that the expedition required, the ability to look at a grizzly bear or a geyser or the Continental Divide with fresh eyes, to be genuinely astonished, to find language for the astonishment. Clark had the steadiness, the practical intelligence, the interpersonal skill, the patience for the long work that Lewis could not sustain. He made the maps. He managed the people. He spent 30 more years doing the unglamorous necessary work of administering a territory that the expedition had opened. Neither would have done what they did without the other. The partnership of Lewis and Clark was genuinely unusual in the history of military exploration, in that it was, despite the formal hierarchy in which Lewis held the higher rank, a true co-command. Lewis designated Clark as co-captain from the beginning over the objections of the War Department, which refused to give Clark the captain's commission Lewis wanted him to have, granting him a second lieutenant's commission instead, a slight that Clark bore without complaint and that Lewis remedied by simply calling Clark Captain Clark throughout the expedition and insisting that all expedition members do the same. The captains divided duties according to their strengths. Lewis took the lead on scientific observation and difficult diplomatic situations. Clark took the lead on navigation, mapping, and day-to-day management of the men. Their journals are complementary rather than redundant, each filling gaps in the other's account. Their friendship, which began in the militia of the 1790s and lasted until Lewis's death in 1809, was one of the great partnerships in American history. Clark never fully recovered from Lewis's death. His letters in the months after it are subdued, in a way that is not characteristic of his usually practical, forward-moving prose. He wrote to his brother that he had lost his dearest friend. He meant it. He kept Lewis's portrait. It hung in his home in St. Louis until Clark's own death. 2 men, 1 journey, 1 map. Lewis brought the fire of it. Clark made it last. The continent was crossed. The journals were written. The maps were made. And then the quiet years came. Years of debt and decline for one. Years of steady service for the other. Years of ordinary life for the dozens of men who had done something extraordinary and had to find a way to live afterward. Most of them managed. Some didn't. All of them tried. The river moves, the mountains stand. The bitterroot blooms every spring in the rocky soil of Montana, brought back to life, as it always is, by the warmth that always eventually returns. Let everything go now. You are very deep in rest. The story settles around you like the last light settling on the water. Imagine Clark in his last years, sitting in his study in St. Louis. The walls are covered with maps, some his own work, some the work of the engineers and explorers who had come after him, all of them refinements of the great map that he and Lewis had begun together in 1804. He is an old man. His red hair has gone white. His hands, which once gripped a rifle and a paddle and a pen, moving across the pages of a journal in firelight, are stiff with age. Outside the window, the Missouri River catches the late afternoon light. He sits and thinks about the river. He thinks about the first morning on the Missouri, May of 1804, when the keelboats pushed off from Camp Dubois into the brown current and the adventure began. He thinks about the white cliffs and the great falls and the crossing of Lemhi Pass and the miserable wet winter at Fort Clatsop and the long ride home. He thinks about Lewis in the bow of the canoe, Lewis at the campfire writing in the light, Lewis looking at the Continental Divide with that particular expression of concentrated attention that meant he was trying to find the right words. He thinks about Sacagawea with her baby on her back, walking along the bank of the Missouri in the spring of 1805. He thinks about York, voting on the Oregon coast. He thinks about the Mandan villages, so full of life when they arrived, so changed already when the steamboat news came down the river. He thinks about all of it, sitting in his chair in the fading afternoon light, with the maps on the walls around him and the river moving outside and the world transformed beyond recognition from the world that had made him. It was worth it. Whatever it cost, and it cost so much for so many, the journey was worth it. The journals were worth it. The maps were worth it. The knowing was worth it. The river moves. Lewis is 35 years old and walking into the western wilderness, and the whole world is ahead of him. And he is looking at it with those clear, attentive eyes, and nothing has been lost yet. Clark closes his eyes. The Missouri runs past, brown and wide, carrying the mountains in its silt, carrying everything downstream toward the sea. Rest now, the maps are on the wall. The river is moving, the bitterroot is blooming somewhere in the rocky soil of Montana. Everything that was lost is held in the pages of the journals. The mountains stand. They always stand. Sleep. The river remembers every mile.